Hi everybody, it's Ed from Ed Shed here with Ben and Kristyan Panzica. And we're going to introduce him as one of the most interesting men I've ever met. He's a world traveler, a playwright, poet, clarinet player. He's been all around. He wrote books. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big hand for Kristyan Panzica. Woohoo! So you tell me some interesting things about your childhood. You grew up in New York City, and you met Dylan Thomas, and you heard him. And I mean, that's pretty hefty company. So tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I was well prepared for all these things. My father was a surgeon, and I only saw him usually Sundays when he was visiting his patients in the hospital.
Uh-huh.
And I would walk through the corridors with him, and then we would go for lunch and that sort of thing. But my mother was the office manager of the Warner Brothers Film Distributing Center, and I would get to see screenings of movies that would go into theaters twice a week, where the managers were there and they decided if it was appropriate for their theaters. So it was great because I got to see all these movies. My mother would take me to dinner. I'd see these movies. I had a great aunt that would take me to operas.
That's you led quite a life there, getting exposed to a lot of culture.
Well, for a kid who didn't want to, it helped me two ways. The noir movies prepared me for the dark nightlife, for the jazz clubs, for the back alleys of the world. On the other hand, I didn't want to come out. I wrote a poem called Dive, and I'll read it very soon. Dive meant both as a fetus, and it means a lot to women today. You heard the woman at the reading last night who talked about the plight of poor women when they have an unwanted pregnancy.
Right.
I didn't want to come out. Instead of leaping out of my mother's vagina, I dove back in. I was breached. She was 39 years old. She was 2 days in labor. And they ended up having to grab me and pull me out feet first. So, from that kid who dove, and then ultimately because of the film noirs and my tendency in being an only child and wanting to go out every night, Dive is a club in a seedy neighborhood where I thrived for many years. So the poem is Dive.
So you're going to read Dive now?
Yeah.
Okay, that's great.
Dive was not a good command for one about to emerge from the birth hole. Rather than leap out, he dove in deeper. Help was needed, though at the time a surgical procedure was unavailable. It was August 1st, 1939. The doctors that could do a cesarean were not around. They were on vacation. To complicate matters, one might say that during the dive, it was as though the chute didn't open as expected. Ultimately, the trapped one was extricated feet first. So as it was in the beginning, as now, and ever shall be. Though there are still holes in space and holes in the ground, the holes between dives are deeper and darker.
That's pretty cool. So tell me a little bit about your association with and your experiences with Dylan Thomas, the famous poet.
Well, at the time, we're talking about the late 40s, early 50s, television was coming out.
Right.
And the quality of program, and at the same time, foreign movies were coming out.
Right.
Fellini, Bergman, Sajat Ray, Kurosawa. So once a kid found out about these things, how was he going to, be satisfied with looking at a little black and white screen. You know,
Right.
watching Howdy Doody or Milton Berle or something. You know.
Right. Your world was expanded early, so
yeah,
you got to see that.
yeah. So we rebelled. We called it the boob tube, and so we went to the West Village. We went to Will Geer's loft. Will Geer was a casualty of the McCarthy period. He had a loft and he welcomed people in. He was trying to figure out what to do with his life. Eventually, he went to Hollywood, and the old lefties got him into westerns. He was always the marshal, the sheriff, you know, that kind of guy, you know. He always had a long. Then at that point, and as a young guy, was very suave, like Wavy Gravy.
Yeah.
Hugh Romney was a very suave young guy. Wavy Gravy. Hugh Romney at the time, I was on the cover. We were together in all the poetry, little poetry cafes.
Right.
He now he's like big, overweight. He's a clown. He's like, you know, he's Wavy Gravy. He went from a very suave, good-looking guy to this, you know, sort of like a full-time clown.
Yeah.
And he has the school.
He's a caricature now.
He's got a camp for kids every summer. A camp for clowns that he has up in Northern California.
Uh-huh.
And he has a parade that he puts on called St. Stupid's Day. It's on April 1st. I always go to it. We have a big parade, and we parade through the fine, and people come in costumes you wouldn't believe.
Where is that? Where is that?
Market Street in San Francisco.
Okay, all right.
And he's still around.
Yeah.
And it's called Camp Win a Rainbow.
Nice, nice. So Dylan Thomas, you went to some of his readings.
Dylan Thomas, we go to
yeah.
his readings, and Dylan had this wonderful booming voice. You know, I to this day I envy that voice.
Right.
And before, in the early part of his readings, he would always read his favorite poets. And man, I admired that so much, because someone told me that, Bruno Bodenheim, he was an eccentric old guy who was hanging around the village all the time.
Right.
He was one of the old, from the Lost Generation.
Do you remember where, what places it was in the village?
Bruno is Washington Square.
Washington Square Park.
We used to hang out
I used to go there a lot too.
And so he said, you know, Kristyan, he said, good readers make good writers. So Dylan Thomas really impressed me, because he started his readings with other writers,
right,
that he appreciated, and he would read some of their writings. So he'd read, before he read his own things, he'd read about 7 or 8 poems by other people.
Do you remember some of his favorites at all, or?
Yeah. I mean, obviously he read Shakespeare, but he read Milton,
Uh-huh.
the Graveyard Poets.
Uh-huh.
Let's see.
That's good.
There's war poets, the Second World, Lewis, you know those guys, McNeice,
Uh-huh.
the war poets from the First and Second World Wars.
Right.
So it was great, good stuff. And now another interesting thing is that we both were interested in Tom Mix. He went to
The cowboy.
Yeah, he would go to these theaters that had, you know, a lot of times he didn't have a place to sleep.
Right.
And so a lot of guys would go to the movie houses in those days, in the 40s, you know, the 50s. They had movies out all day. And they'd go in there and sleep and watch, you know, they had westerns, a lot of western movies. They were cranking out western movies like, if you look at television today,
Right.
there's so many different platforms. There's Hulu, there's Netflix, there's Prime, there's you know, NBC. So in those days it was all there was. It was Tom Mix, Roy Rogers, Hopalong Cassidy, and more. The Whip, the Black Bart.
Yeah.
But we liked Tom Mix for some reason. I don't know what it was. Gene Autry was a little, you know, too commercial. Roy Rogers was a little too saccharine, too cute.
Yeah.
Dale Evans, but he did have Gabby Hayes. And then who had jingles? Andy Devine.
Andy Devine.
Who was his? He was He was another one. He was good. They had these like guys that they were, you know, they were foils that they would work on.
Right.
It was like Brad Morwood and Stephen Lindau.
Sidekicks.
Yeah, very different characters.
Yeah.
So anyway, as you now, then we would go to clubs and we'd see Charlie Parker, for example. And Charlie Parker was a guy you'd want to stay away from because he was always hitting on you for something. He would borrow somebody's. I would talk to a couple of sax players. He'd borrow their sax and never give it back. He'd sell it to get smack, you know. So there are a lot of stories about him in that respect. He was, you know, a tough guy, you know, in terms of that. So anyway, I guess we could go. Let me read the poem about Tom Mix, and then we'll go on to what I did with Dylan Thomas
I love this
later
poem.
on.
It's a good one.
Tom Mix, at a moment's notice, his 6 gun barrels full of blanks, caps in the kid's replica, trail smoke rising darker than dreams of the bride in white lace, no back for her to turn to. The man of her house in a soap opera western rendered them mute, biding their time even if their next-door neighbor were an autistic soothsayer, there to call out the bow-legged husband and the besieged bride, pale as the ghost wife of the Methodist minister at the vintage switch of the 16-millimeter projector. Those Saturday afternoons continue on life support. So anyway, later on I went to, there were 3 attempts, and there were failures of trains, weather, one thing after another. And finally I got on a train, and we had to wait 2 hours at the tunnel going from England to Wales. Finally we got through. Got off the train in Cardiff, got a bus to Swansea, where Dylan's father was a minister. And then I went to the wonderful little seaside town of Mumbles. My Mumbles in California, and if you ever come out to visit us, Bolinas. It's about a 45-minute ride.
I've been. I like that place.
That's my Mumbles.
Great place.
And so when I went there, I went to this place now in a little bookstore in Swansea. That's near Cardiff, where he's from. I channeled Dylan's muse through a proprietor of a bookstore in Swansea, and now when I go to Washington Square Park for a visit, I channel Charlie Parker, I channel Dylan, and others. Now, eventually, when I was just starting to read poetry, I was just out of college and out of the Air Force, and I went to live on the Lower East Side in New York.
Where'd you go to college?
Harvard.
Nice.
And there came a day when Dylan and Charlie Parker were long dead, and I found myself at a memorial open poetry reading in honor of Dylan Thomas at St. Mark's on the Bowery Church. In the audience were people like John Barham and Robert Lowell, Allen Ginsberg. And as the reading started, I was tense. I had hardly ever read before. I read for friends. I never read a reading. And this was, what a thing to start at. I mean, this was, you know. So I noticed that when John Barrowman was reading, it felt like he could go off the rails at any moment. That's how, I would say, tremendous angst, tremendous schadenfreude. Amazing stuff, and his poetry was brilliant. So I felt better if a guy like that, so someone he was revered, was that tense.
Right.
I would, why should I be, what do I have to lose?
Right, exactly.
I have no reputation. So anyway, so I used that, and then after that, I continued on and back to the idea of dive. all during my quest while foraging for camaraderie and inspiration as a writer. I've apparently been oblivious to that uncovered manhole above the infernal sewerage flow in which no human being has ever been redeemed. Wow. I think of Dylan. I think of his poem, I must be better than average at seeing in the dark. And I can hear his poem, him reading Fern Hill.
Now, as I was young and easy under the apple boughs, about the lilting house and happy as the grass was green, the night above the dingle starry, time let me hail and climb, golden in the heydays of his eyes, and honored among wagons, I was prince of the apple towns. And once below a time, I lordly had the trees and leaves trail with daisies and barley down the rivers of the windfall light. And I, as I was green and carefree, famous among the barns about the happy yard, and singing as the farm was home, in the sun that is young once only. Time let me play and be golden in the mercy of his means. And the green and golden I was huntsman and herdsman. The calves sang to my horn. The foxes on the hills barked clear and cold, and the Sabbath rang slowly in the pebbles of the holy streams. All the sun long it was running, it was lovely, the hay fields high as the house, the tunes from the chimneys, it was air, and playing lovely and watery and fire green as grass, and nightly under the simple stars. As I rode to sleep, the owls were bearing the farm away. All the moon long I heard, blessed among stables, the night jars.
Thank you, Dylan Thomas. So, would you like to play some clarinet?
Yeah. Actually, what I've done over the years is, at readings, is I read a few poems. And then based on where the particular poem or poems took me spiritually, then I would channel that into the music,
Okay.
into playing, the improvisation of the music. So, I think what I'll start doing is reading first a couple of things. I just had a book published. That's another interesting story. My first publisher was a vet from the Korean War.
Okay.
He came back from Korea like many guys with hepatitis C. A lot of Korean War vets came back with. A lot of Vietnam vets came back with Agent Orange. Now, through you remember Namaya. Namaya's done a lot of research. It wasn't just Agent Orange. It was Asian Purple. It was Asian Yellow. They had all these different chemicals.
Chemicals,
They used
defoliants.
disaster. But anyway, based on that, he couldn't do much. So he figured out how he could make a living. He got grants, and he was writing poetry, and he was able to publish all the experimental writers. And he would get grants to publish new poetry and stories of an experimental nature. And so he was able to sustain himself and get his friends published.
Nice.
And he'd make some money. He'd take them to book shows and so forth, and then we would get paid in copies, and I would have enough copies to give to friends I thought would be interested in my work.
Right.
And that's all I ever wanted from writing. That was,
Yeah.
you know, and
He
now
gave me a couple of your books, and I appreciate that. Thank you for that.
he died. In fact, I was taking him to the vet's hospital frequently to get his interferon shots. Now they've done better than that, you know, and they're curing people of hepatitis C. Also Lyme's disease, but he passed away. But another guy
When
who
did he pass
published
away?
me, huh?
When did he pass away?
About 7 years ago.
Oh. Okay.
Now another guy who was publishing me before that, and now this is miraculous, appeared after he died. I didn't know what happened to him, but he was off doing something else, and he said, you know, Kristyan, what are you doing these? Are you still writing? Do you have something for me? And he was off the grid and totally independent. I don't think he even knew HD.
Nice.
One guy was
Nice.
H.D. Moe, the other was Christopher Bernard.
Right.
I'm on Facebook with Christopher all the time. We exchange poems and things like that. So there he is, same deal. And you know, very fortunate. But I live in San Francisco. Where else could that happen? And H.D. lived in Berkeley, but he
Nice.
spent a lot of time in San Francisco. I met him at the farm. There was one last farm in San Francisco, and they used to have big poetry readings there.
Nice.
It's no longer exists.
Oh.
And Christopher I met through, Christopher lived right near the Art Institute, which is another thing it is.
Yeah, yeah.
And I would go there, and we go there and have a cup of coffee, and beautiful view of Coit Tower and all of San Francisco from the deck on top of the Art Institute. We'd see the new shows, they had readings, they had all sorts of concerts that they are.
Right.
Some beautiful rooms there. It was like going to an ancient monastery.
Beautiful.
And it's closing.
Oh, it's closing? I
Yes,
didn't know that.
I told you about the woman. She's a woman. I just heard from her on Facebook. She's an artist, and we have that connection where I used to go to see Father Roger, who was writing a book about a medieval sister who wrote about her life and her unions with Christ. It lasted a couple of days. 1200, 900 AD, there were sisters whose unions with Christ lasted 2 weeks. But the church they were able to incorporate that into their rituals. So when a woman went off on that, she was well taken care of. Just like the Native Americans, when they were taking peyote.
Right.
I didn't do much peyote, very little, maybe once or twice. But I knew the peyote church in Taos.
Right.
And it was the ritual of peyote is you'd live close to nature, you'd get all your work done, and you'd do some peyote, and everyone respected your space for a week, and you would go off. And it was very similar to the medieval sisters and their unions with Christ. It was that numinous, highly spiritual experience.
Higher level of consciousness type of deal.
Yeah.
Pursuit of that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I experience it more often in sweat lodges. I do sweat lodges with Native Americans.
Right.
And when we're in the sweat lodge and we sing together, usually somebody's drumming inside and leading us. We get to a point where our voices converge inside of the sweat lodge. You feel that it goes out of you and connects with others.
Is that similar to kirtan, like the Indian chanting of kirtan? It's like it's a movement that they all gather together and reach a higher consciousness through unity.
Yeah, there's various ways to do it.
Yeah.
You could do it through chanting. Tibet, of course, the Tibetans do it.
Right.
The most recent research in that area is they were connected. The monks in a very highly meditative state. They had electrodes on their heads, and when they were in a meditative state, theoretically, no thinking was going on. their brainwaves were going through the roof. That the meters were way over.
Right.
And they were meditating. There was no, they weren't going through a lot of thinking or anything, but there was that energy, and it was indexed on the meters.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. I'd like to explore more of that.
Yeah. So I think poetry. When I'm reading poetry, I'm hearing poetry. I get into that state as well.
All right.
Well, I'm telling you. Let me read one.
Okay, read one.
Something from. These are very recent. These are the most recent things I've written, and it's in a book called F. F is the main character in the book, and it has something. The first words in the book are four flusher, and the last words
Show the spine for a
are
second. That's
fortune.
Kristyan Panzica.
And so at the very end of it, of the end of the book, the protagonist is waiting to see an art critic. It's about art forgery. And he's waiting, and then he looks at a magazine there, and it's they're having a symposium on the F word. So everybody's writing poems about their take on the F word or the F-bomb. But I never use the word. I try to avoid using profanities in my writing.
Yeah.
There'll be suggestions, or violence. I don't even have a slap in my books. I might suggest something, but I don't get into it,
Yeah.
because I abhor any kind of violence.
Sure.
So anyway,
That's admirable.
what would be here, how about this one? Of course, the pentacles I have to do with tarot cards. She proudly wears, she's known, on her garments they're sewn, below and above her navel, there for the initiated to marvel. Considering those who stroll between midnight and dawn, to them she's inexorably drawn. What fortune is theirs to extol? That poet one night she reached, imagined the gods they beseeched, both inspired by a mutual whim. Her radiance soon enveloped him. At clairvoyance she no doubt did excel. Who dared fathom how deep her well?
Nice. That was beautiful. So that's your latest book. Do you have any other books that you
I
you have written?
wrote, before this one, I wrote a trilogy of science fiction.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Interesting.
3 books. And the science fiction story was started out in the membrane, which is the membrane is a halo around the multiverse, where anything is possible, and it's always been there and always will be there. And so a force from the membrane was looking around at habitable planets. And she took the form of a woman. She was omnipotent. There was nothing that she couldn't understand and achieve. So as a woman, she wanted to basically get to meet people and feel out what was going on this planet. So it starts off with her arriving here. It starts off with a couple that's had been dating for a long time, and then their parents died, and they drove west. And they had a little home outside of San Francisco, and one day there's a young woman sitting on their hammock in the backyard, and that's her. And so they have a relationship. That's book 1. Book 2 is what she does in that area. And then she leaves that area and goes up to Northern California and then to the East Coast because of a series of meetings. And the 3rd book ends with her on the verge of going to Canada. So I'm thinking about making the trilogy a quartet, like Lawrence Durrell's Alexandria Quartet.
Nice.
So we'll see what happens. You know what? I did I did a very foolish thing.
What is this?
I had a gumdrop, and my fingers are sticky.
Okay, let's
I need
wash
some water.
your hands there.
Yeah. So
We'll
give
hold
a
on for a second.
little
Let's
break.
go into there. So we've been blessed so far to hear Kristyan Panzica, a lot about his very storied life and his trips to New York City and his brushes with all types of fame. And here's Dylan Thomas himself right here, reincarnated.
I have to say, I'm impressed with Kristyan.
Do you have any haiku about Kristyan?
I don't.
Okay.
No.
Dylan Thomas, I don't know if you did haiku, did you?
I had many more words than are allowed in haiku.
Many more words than are allowed in haiku. That sounds like a book.
Indeed.
A book.
Yes.
And I heard, Dylan Thomas, I heard you had two friends. One was called Ben, not James, and the other one was called Ben, not Bert.
Ben, not Bert.
So what happened with that Ben, not Bert? What is
It's
that
that
about?
whole RTN thing.
Yeah. Sometimes it's hard to understand. And we have all sorts of possibilities going on. I think Kristyan, when he comes back, is going to play some clarinet.
Yeah.
Sometimes he plays clarinet in back of my poetry. I don't think we're going to do any of that tonight, but last night at St. Pete Lit Studio 620 open mic, we had a beautiful night of poetry, and I did Meditation Monkey and 10 month summer.
We've heard of that up there.
What? You heard it up there, up in heaven?
Mm-hmm.
And then we have Shamsia Live open mic up at Safety Harbor Writers and Poets, and we have Safety Harbor Art and Music Center, which is a great place that Kristyan also comes to, and Ben does too, and so do I. And hey, Kristyan's going to come back and play some
How about
clarinet.
play some clarinet?
All right, here we go. And ladies and gentlemen, we have the man of the hour back.
Without sticky
Incidentally,
fingers.
One other point of interest in that is that when I give readings, oftentimes I'll read a series of poems and then play the clarinet based on where the poems I've just read took me,
Right.
and then improvise from there.
Beautiful.
But this time somehow I was in Santa Fe recently and heard a raggle-taggle band playing on the sunny side of the street.
Nice.
And they were, I mean, you couldn't put a more disparate bunch of characters together. There was a fiddler, a trumpet player, a singer who was leading them, a fiddler, someone playing drums, and a guitar.
Nice.
Well, maybe they were all stranded. A child stranded in the pristine woods, who survived on crab apples and mushrooms, sat high in a tree until rifle shots rang out. When the bullet hit a branch, all the songbirds skedaddled, while he and a squirrel scampered down the trunk and made a beeline for the creek. Over slate slabs sheltering crabs, and through a current full of minnows and water spiders, he waded out of the defiled forest. Oddly enough, it's a true story. It happened to me when I was a little boy on my great-grandfather's farm, and because they had so many children, so many of them lived around their farm, I could go into the woods for 2 or 3 days and live on berries and mushrooms. Nobody worried because they thought I was at an uncle's house or an aunt's house. Nearby.
Where was the father's farm?
Jamestown, New York, near Stockwell Foundation.
Nice.
between Buffalo and Erie, Pennsylvania.
Nice, nice. Western New York.
Yep.
Kristyan Panzica, man of many talents. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Anything else you want to add before we wrap it up? Where do you go next? Where do you go next?
For goodness sake, this is a beginning.
Nice. So where do you go next? Where do you, I heard you're going out to San Francisco again.
Brickyard Landing. I live where the trains used to go from San Francisco to Ferry Point.
Uh-huh.
And then there was a siding, and the track used to go to a place where bricks were kilned. So we have an Olympic-sized pool that I swim in every day. Oh, glory. And interesting people to talk to around there.
Nice.
And I get my daily exercise in them, and right in under where I live. And just beyond the pool, right beyond the pool, there's a huge brick smokestack and two huge round kilns from the old days.
Nice.
When they made all the bricks for San Francisco.
Beautiful.
Of course, it's very phallic, you know. It's, but,
You think it's phallic.
you know. With me,
Whatever turns you on,
it's
Kristyan.
not a cross. It's a couple embracing, dude, connected, feeling the universe.
All right, so let's wrap this up, and I want to thank Kristyan Panzica for joining us on Ed's Shed, Trapped in the Shed. And let's bring up Ben. Ben was on the show. Let's talk. Ben is saying
It's a pleasure to see you all out there. You have a great night.
All right, man. Thanks a lot from Ed's Shed and Trapped in the Shed with Kristyan Panzica. Peace and love to everybody.